So as the Iran war continues to create global uncertainty and market volatility, Donald Trump is turning his attention to another area, issuing a stark warning to not Iran or even Hezbollah in Lebanon, but to America's allies, the ones that he assumes to be in, or that he can pick up and put down as he wishes. Basically, that if Europe doesn't help the US reopen and manage, protect, patrol the Strait of Hormuz during this conflict, then the whole of the future of NATO could be in question, or to simply say it as he did, very bad. Now, in principle, that might seem like an extraordinary statement because it suggests that the future of the entire Western alliance, the security architecture that has underpinned Europe for much of the past 75 years, is now depending on whether European countries join a war that they never were consulted about, let alone asked to join, or wanted in the first place. But of course, the real story goes much deeper, because the crisis is exposing to me two things simultaneously. Firstly, the extraordinary contradictions in Trump's foreign policy, shocking perhaps, where allies are insulted, threatened with tariffs, and then told they are freeloaders, saying that they didn't do enough in NATO during either wars, say in only then to be asked for that military help when Washington just decides that they want it. And second, though, Europe's own strategic weakness, the latest test for the continent and its attempt to be united. Because while European leaders are understandably reluctant to join Trump's war, they are also facing a brutal reality. We have to be practical here. Europe is going to be, and is already, one of the biggest losers, economic losers of this conflict. So how do they balance that? In this video, I wanted to unpack that exact crisis and what it is revealing. Why Trump is pressuring NATO to join the war now, why Europe is rightfully resisting, and why this moment may be becoming one of the biggest strategic moments for Europe more broadly, as we all try to adjust to this ever-changing global system. Let's get into it.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the channel. If you're new, this is a show that looks at geopolitics, economics, and international relations. And while I try to be relatively balanced in my videos, occasionally I will be more opinionated. Frankly, to me, it boils down to one simple element, which I think is the question most people are asking, not necessarily just in Europe, but what is the goal here? What are the strategic objectives? It is the lack of strategic clarity within the Trump administration, let alone between Israel and the United States, which clearly have differing opinions of the lengths they're willing to go to with this conflict, that is undermining the desire of other countries, including the GCC or the Gulf states, to get more involved in whatever that may be that offensive strikes into Iran itself or securing the shipping lanes. More on that, though, in a second. In this instance, it's pretty blunt that Trump is requesting and assuming the Europeans will come to help. But this is a war that he started and, frankly, no one really wanted. Not that no one wants to see the Islamic Republic removed either. But let me know in the comments, what do you think about this? It puts Europe in a predicament, and let's not be beat around the bush. Of course, Europe is going to have to do something. They can't not. They have to because of the economic pressures this is putting on the continent. The Belgian Prime Minister even suggesting that relations with Russia should be normalized because of what's happening. It basically just underlines for me the importance that Europe must continue to seek out on its own, to go out on its own and not be dependent on any one large player, including the United States. We don't live in a world where over-reliance on anyone is good. I mean, I'm going to be making a video on the UK and the need for independent nuclear capabilities because of what's been happening over the Middle East. So, of course, the immediate trigger for all of this is the precarious situation in the Strait of Hormuz. There's a lot of debate around who controls it. Do the Iranians? Do the Americans? Roughly 20% of world's oil supply flows through there, as you know, and the United States and Israel's various operations and campaign against Iran are shutting down much of the provision of oil supply, gas supply, and that's sent costs going through the roof for a lot of European countries. Oil prices have surged above $106 per barrel, as high as almost 120. And for Europe and Asia, this isn't just an abstract geopolitical issue. It is an absolute central emergency. In many ways, Asia is actually worse off than Europe. but perhaps less from an energy-specific standpoint. European economies depend heavily on the energy flows from the Gulf. That only increased after Putin's invasion of Ukraine fully 4 years ago. But for Washington, the stakes are slightly different, or specifically Trump. The US has been far less dependent on Middle Eastern oil than it once was. And so from Trump's perspective, the country that benefits most from this, the Strait, i.e. the United States, it's less of a risk for them. But other countries that also rely on their energy, namely the Europeans, should be doing more to secure it. But again, the biggest problem with that is that this isn't necessarily the way that Europe would have gone about trying to do so. He's argued that different countries benefit in the Strait should help protect it, that if they don't, therefore NATO will be facing a very bad situation. Now, in my mind, I find that a little bit overstated. Trump still sees the symbolic value of being part of NATO and the UN. That's why he's perhaps left a bunch of organizations of the UN, but I don't think we'll leave it entirely. And the same with NATO. But he's called for European countries to send minesweepers, Navy patrols, and even special forces units to target Iranian capabilities. But that would make them culpable. I.e., he wants NATO allies to directly participate in military operations linked to this conflict. But this is where the dispute, well, it really boils down. Because from the perspective of Europe, at least, this isn't NATO's war, it's America's. And independent nations of Europe can talk about getting involved, but NATO as a whole, effectively triggering Article 5, or a right to defend is a right to all being defended, right? Or attack on one is an attack on all. So across Europe, governments are very cautious about this and bluntly rejected the idea. This is most notable in Germany earlier today, where Berlin basically stated this is not NATO's war, emphasizing that the alliance is a defensive pact, not an interventional force, although some would argue about Kosovo or Libya as demonstrations where NATO has been interventionary. Other countries aside from Germany have taken a similar position. They are willing to discuss protecting shipping or maritime trade routes as long as it falls under international law. But they don't want to be drawn into the wider military campaign. And that's based on a political reality, which is that the US launched this war without consulting NATO allies. And then suddenly for Trump to draw up an expectation they'll be getting involved is just wrong and frankly farcical. Washington is asking those allies to put up ships, sailors, soldiers, assets at risk. And for many European governments, this is a proposition not just difficult to sell politically, but just, well, it's not their business. If European countries want to undertake defensive posture to protect certain assets, that's one thing. But to actively be getting involved in an interventionist manner in the Iranian conflict by striking targets, well, that makes them liable to be directly targeted by Iranian rockets, drones, and so on. Now, the UK, for example, is a very cautious but revealing stance here. The Prime Minister Keir Starmer has said Britain will protect the shipping lanes, or suggested. He seems to have been deviating on that. But they won't be drawn in. And that distinction is crucial because London recognises the strategic importance of reopening the Strait of Hormuz, keeping it open, but it also recognises that joining a war whose objectives remain unclear is not a good idea. And the position reflects a broader European dilemma. Europe wants stability in the Gulf, but it does not want to become a participant in a conflict that it has ultimately no say. Iran seemingly did target Cyprus, but the completely unacceptable response by the British government shows the quandary, the conundrum that a lot of European capitals are going through. And so this is another key part that I wanted to get to. Trump's approach looks very contradictory. The biggest consideration of this isn't so much about the economic fallout or the spillover effect as it is the lack of strategic clarity. There seems to be a lack of clear idea from the Trump administration, let alone between the United States and Israel, about what it is they exactly want. Initially, it was about regime change, but that seems to be watered down, and it's about eradicating the Navy or eradicating the military architecture. But then it's also been said, no, it's primarily about nuclear facilities. There doesn't seem to be any coherency within the US strategy over this, and that's exactly why the Europeans don't want to be caught up in a conflict with no clear off-ramp. Now, that's not to say that Europe doesn't have a uncomfortable reality here. even if this is not Europe's war politically, it is already economically. Europe is far more exposed to disruptions in Middle Eastern energy supplies than the US. And the Strait of Hormuz, if it remains unstable for months, the economic consequences for Europe could be absolutely catastrophic. We saw what happened to Europe in the first few months after Putin invaded Ukraine, and whilst this level hasn't reached that quite yet, the structural realignment and time it took to alleviate those pressures was so long. And we already have heightened price levels, we already have sticky inflation, we already have stagnant economies. It's not something that could really be, I think, possible for more European economies to manage. So while European governments may resist Trump's pressures now, they will be working hard behind the scenes to find a level of what they're willing to get involved with and how, because their own economic strategic interests require it. Indeed, if it does become involved, Europe will certainly insist on it being on their own terms. So avoiding participation and trying to negotiate with the Iranians to either have their ships pass through without being targeted, as France and Italy were attempting to do earlier last week. But that doesn't guarantee anything in the fog of war. You could do things like multinational naval missions or international agreements to guarantee safe shipping passage, as we saw during times of the Somalian pirates around 2011. But even after that, you still required a degree of hard power. The European Union has been discussing whether existing naval operations in the region could be expanded to protect commercial vessels, and that aim would be very clear. You protect your shipping, you stabilize those energy flows, but you don't take offensive strikes into Iran itself, for example. But this crisis, of course, exposes the deepest weakness inside Europe. The continent still struggles to act with a single strategic, coherent voice. Some governments favour stronger military responses, hawks. Others prefer diplomacy or to be more restrained or not be involved at all, like Spain does. That fragmentation continues to limit Europe's ability to act as a serious geopolitical player, therefore. And it means that even when Europe's own interests are directly affected, it often struggles to respond consistently. And so in that sense, it becomes one of its biggest strategic tests in my mind. Not because of Trump's threats so much, but because of what it reveals about Europe. Can the EU, can Europe as a continent defend itself, its interests, find a mixture of soft power and hard power, what Joseph Nye, a famous academic, called smart power, something that Trump doesn't seem to really want to use. He doesn't like soft power, he fully utilizes hard power. These are the questions that underpin the idea of this strategic autonomy, and whether this kind of inflection point in international relations, sort of like a Suez Canal crisis, you could argue, will actually achieve that. Some people even argue that this could be the push that comes to shove of a more potential federalization of Europe. That if you have a federal Europe with a overall majority decision-making body or approach, then you could actually ensure decisions being made as much as meetings being held. Because even when Europe recognizes its interests clearly, it struggles to act decisively. And that is probably the biggest lesson for me right now, is how much can Europe come through in not just words, but with action. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. As I say, I'm very curious to hear what you think. And if you enjoyed the video, do give it a like, subscribe, and we'll see you all in the next one. Some exciting stuff coming up. Thanks very much for watching. Take care.